Today we're gonna do a demo on how to develop a simple Android application using Android Studio. And as you can see, I'm using Android Studio version 3.3.1. And we're gonna begin by starting a new Android Studio project. So we're gonna click here. And as you can see, we have the options of starting different kinds of projects. So for phone and tablets, Wear OS, TV, Android Auto, Android Things. So Android now really runs on a number of devices. But what we're gonna do instead is just developing something for a phone or a tablet, which I guess are still the most commonly used apps. And we're gonna start by selecting empty activity. Again, as you can see, you have multiple options. You can start with a completely empty project, or you can have some template activities in case you need to do something specific. We're going to start with an empty activity so that we're going to do everything from scratch. So we select next. We're going to give a name of the application. I'm going to build an application to convert miles to kilometers and vice versa. So we're going to call this converter. And the package is fine. We're going to select a package name that is meaningful to us, and we're going to do this in a specific location. So let me put it here in this directory, core converter. Let me see if this is fine. And we're going to select Java language for the application. And as you can see, and you have the options also to select Kotlin, which is a more modern language that is a little more, say, concise than Java, a little more effective, but we're going to just stick with Java for simplicity. And we're going to select that we're going to run our application on an API 26, so Android 8.0. And one nice thing is that the application, so the Android Studio tells you on how many devices you should expect this to run, which means that as far as Google knows, 6.0% of the devices are currently running Android 8.0. So if you want to be more broadly usable, you might decide to go for a kind of a lower version of the APIs. But for now, we just stick to API 26. Also, you can decide whether your project will support instant apps, which means that your app will be able to run without being actually installed. But again, we don't care for that right now, so we're just gonna not select this part. So at this point, we finish, and unless I did something wrong, the whole application should be bootstrapped, which means that the initial set of files is being generated. The application is also being compiled and built. And as you can see, what we have here is two main things. So we have a main activity, which is the activity that we selected, and it doesn't do much. All it does is override this onCreate method. And if you remember from the lesson on Android, the onCreate method is the one that is called where your application is first started. So when it's started initially, or when it's killed by the system and the user goes back to the application. And it's pretty much empty. All it does is just invoke the super constructor, and then to set the content view. But we don't have to worry about this for now. And the other thing that you can notice is that we have a layout file that is being created for this application. That's what we're going to play with. It's the activity main.xml. It's an XML file, and you have an option to see it as in designer mode. In designer mode, what you can do is basically drag and drop your widget to the application. So right now, if you can see, there's only, and we can minimize this in order to see it a little bigger. What you're seeing here is basically the screen of the phone or tablet, the device on which the application will run. And all this application does is just generate a hello world string in the center of the screen. And notice that this layout actually corresponds to an XML file which contains the information in textual format. But of course, working at the design level, it's a little easier, especially if you're not an expert, or if you want to create the first sketch of the interface that then you can refine possibly in the textual version. The first thing we're going to do, we're going to try to run this application, so this kind of a bare bone application just to make sure that we have a good starting point, that our emulator is working, and so on. So I'm going to do two things. So first I'm going to select the layout for the Pixel 2 phone. This just to select the initial resolution according to a specific device, but it's just as long as you pick something reasonable, that will, any device will do. And then we're going to run it. So we're going to click this button and we're going to run the application. We're going to say that we want to run it on, I got two virtual devices. We say we're going to run it on this Pixel 2 device, which has got the right API. And when I run it, what it does, it launches the device, it copies the application over, and it runs it. And as you can see, you have the name of the application here, which is a converter, that's the name we gave it, and it just says hello world. Okay, so nothing particularly exciting. So we can kill this one so that we start from scratch the next time we start the emulator, and then we can close the emulator. So at this point, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to build the GUI for our application. As I said, it's a converter. So we're going to first of all get rid of this hello world string, which we don't need. And then we're going to pick a layout for the app. What's a layout? A layout is something that tells the application how the widgets should be positioned on the screen. So we're going to do something very simple. We're going to pick a linear layout that is vertical, and we're going to just drag it here. And so what this is saying is that if I start putting widgets in here, they'll be stacked vertically, one after the other. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to put, even though my application has a title, I'm going to just have a label that says what the application is. So I'm going to take a plain test widget. I'm going to drag it here. So it's going to be put at the top. As I said, this is a vertical layout. And I'm going to call this converter miles kilometers, for lack of a better name, and then I'm gonna center this. So something else to notice is that when I select a widget, I see here the properties of the widget, and so in this case I can select the text alignment as center, and I'm gonna make the text a little bigger. So let's say, for example, 30 points. Okay, so this is the application, and with the title. At this point, I want to create a simple interface where the first thing I have in the interface is a selection through a radio button of whether I'm converting from miles to kilometers or the other way around. So we're gonna first of all put another layout here, which is a horizontal layout. What that means is that now I have stack layouts that you can see here. I have a linear layout horizontal within a vertical linear layout. So it means that the widgets I put here now are going to go into this layout, and they're going to be put one next to the other horizontally in this case. So I'm also going to reduce this a little bit so that it doesn't take up the whole screen. And what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna take one plain text widget again. This is gonna be the label for the buttons, and I'm gonna put there as text convert from. And after I've done this, I'm gonna add my radio buttons. And since I want my radio buttons to be connected one to the other, so that when I select kilometers, the miles ones gets unselected and the other way around, I'm gonna put them in a radio group. So I'm gonna just bring my radio group here. And as you can see, when I add the radio group, it gets added here to the right of the label, which is where I dragged it. And the reason why I put it here is because, again, we are within a horizontal layout. So I do this, I'm gonna extend this a little bit so that we can read the whole from, and then I'm gonna put two radio buttons in here. So I'm gonna put radio button number 1 and radio button number 2. And since I don't want the radio buttons to be vertically aligned, I like them horizontally, what I can do, I can select my radio group, and I can change its properties here. So in this case, this is not a basic attribute, so we're gonna click here on View All Attributes. We're gonna go to Orientation, and we're gonna change orientation to horizontal. And when we change this, we can see the radio buttons aligned here. And just to make sure, I'm gonna show you again. As you can see, in the meanwhile, my XML file that indicates the layout is being populated. So here you can see the radio group, the radio button. So again, you could do all this textually. It's just that doing it graphically can be a little easier, especially initially, especially if you're not an expert. So another thing I'm gonna do, I'm gonna change the font for my radio buttons. So I'm gonna make them a little bigger so that they're more readable. So this one and this one, I'm gonna both make 18 points. And I'm gonna give them some meaningful names. So let's say that here I'm gonna put kilometers, which indicates that when this is selected, I'm gonna select from kilometers to miles. And for this one, I'm gonna have the label miles. Another very important thing that I need to do is that I need to be able to refer to these widgets from within my applications. And to do that, I'm gonna use an ID. So as you can see, the ID is indicated here among the properties. And in this case, it's called radio button simply because it's just the default name. I'm gonna use something a little more meaningful. So I'm gonna call it RB for radio button, and I'm gonna call it from kilometers. So which indicates that this is my radio button that shows that the user wants to translate from kilometers to miles. I'm also gonna set the checked value here so that this is checked by default, so when the application starts. And I'm gonna do a similar thing here. So for miles, I'm gonna say that this is the radio button from miles. Okay, and at this point, I got my the first part of my GUI defined. The next thing I wanna do is I wanna have two entries. One is for the values to convert, and the other one is for the result. So again, I'm gonna do a similar thing to what I just did. I'm gonna use a horizontal linear layout. So I'm gonna put one here, and this layout is gonna be the one containing the value that I want to translate. So again, I'm gonna use a text label just to indicate that this is the value. So I'm gonna call it value. And I'm gonna have a numeric text entry and a decimal one. I can be fairly specific here. And what this is saying is basically that this is where the value will be entered by the user. So similarly, I'm gonna add another layout, another horizontal layout under this. And again, I'm gonna reduce its size a little bit. And let's make it the same size as the other one. All right, and we're gonna put again a label here, and this we're gonna call it result. And then we're gonna have another numeric entry here, which is the one containing the actual result of the computation. Something else again that I need to do is to assign meaningful IDs to this, because I want to be able to refer to them from within the application. So in this case, I'm gonna call this value simply, and I'm gonna call this one result. So it's fairly straightforward and intuitive. And the last thing I need to do is to put there something that triggers the conversion. So I'm gonna use yet again a horizontal layout here. I'm gonna make the layout smaller as before. So again, let's make it the same size also in this case. And I'm gonna put two buttons here, two actual buttons, button number 1 and button number 2. So button number 1 is gonna be my convert button. So I'm gonna give it this label. And button number 2, let's say, is gonna be a reset button. So something that I can click in order to reset the whole interface. And at this point, I'm pretty much done. The last thing I need to do is to, again, give an ID that is easy to remember to this button, convert, and this one I'm gonna call button reset. And at this point, I should pretty much be done with the interface. As you can see, it's a fairly simple interface, but it does its job, so it does what we need it to do. So what we can do at this point is to run our application, compile and run our application, and this, of course, the application is not going to do anything because there's nothing behind the GUI, but at least that we can see whether the GUI is rendered correctly and whether we can interact with it. So if we push the run button and we say we're going to run it on the Pixel 2 emulator again, the emulator will be launched, like in this case here. And as you can see, the application starts, looks the way we defined it. We can change the radio button because this is something that, is only at the GUI level, so nothing happens behind the scenes except for the fact that this gets selected or not. We can even put values here, and we can even push these buttons, but since there's nothing connected to the buttons, nothing happens, so the event is just being discarded. So as you can see, the GUI works. Now we just have to build whatever is behind the GUI. So let me kill this application so that we can start from scratch again when we relaunch the actual application. So at this point, what we need to do is to put the logic in the application that can actually make the GUI work as it is expected to work. So we're gonna go back to our main activity.java. If you remember the empty skeleton of our main activity. The first thing we need is we need to define fields that are going to allow us to access the widgets that are relevant for our application. And there's 4 widgets that we really need to reference in the application. The 2 radio buttons that define whether we're converting from kilometers to miles, and the value to convert, and the result value. But let's first create this fields to reference this element. So I'm gonna create radio button, and I'm gonna be calling it. So this is the one to convert from kilometers. I'm gonna be calling. Actually, let's just call it radio button from kilometers, and I'm gonna have another radio button. I'm just gonna copy this to be quicker, and this is going to call radio button from miles. And then we need the 2 text fields, which are the type for this is edit text. So edit text, and we're going to call the one text value, which is the input value, and the other one is also an edit text. We're going to call it text result. Okay, so at this point we need to assign the right widgets to these elements. And how do we do this? So to do this, we're gonna leverage something that gets created automatically in Android, which is this class called R. And the class R basically contains much information about the application, and in particular, it contains information about the IDs in the application. So the way in which we do this, we just initialize the values that we defined. So radio buttons from kilometers, and what we need to do is several things. So the first one is we're gonna use this find view by ID, which is a method that allows you to go from an ID to an actual object, an actual widget, and then we're gonna get the ID. And the ID, as we said, is in this class R, and it's field ID, which contains all these IDs, and we're gonna use the IDs that we define. As you can see, the auto completion offers the IDs that we defined. In this case, RB from kilometer is the one that we want, so we just select that. And at this point, we have recovered the ID using this mapping class. We're getting the correct widgets for it by using this find view by ID. And all we need to do is, since find view by ID returns generic objects, we're gonna cast this to the right type. So we're gonna say that this is a radio button. I'm not gonna spend the same time on the other one. I'm just gonna do it. So now we have the one from miles. And in this case, we're doing exactly the same thing, but we're using RB from miles. So now we're gonna add the 2 edit texts. So again, the first one is called text value, and we're gonna cast it to edit text, and we're gonna get it in the same way. Find, is equal to find view by ID, and again r.id dot. In this case, we simply called it value, if I recall correctly, and so that's what we're going to use. And finally, oops, the equal sign in the wrong spot. Now we're gonna convert the final one, and this one is the text result. And for this one, we're gonna get the ID result, which is the one that we defined. And so at this point, what happens is that when the app is created, this method is called, and at the end of the execution, as I was saying, this will be references to the right widgets that I defined in my GUI. The first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to create two methods here to convert from miles to kilometers and vice versa. I'm just going to copy the methods here for the sake of time, and so there's not really too much to say this. So all the methods do is to take a string that represent a value in either miles or kilometers and give you back kilometers or miles depending on the one that you call. So this we're going to use within my method. The last thing I need to do is to handle the pressing of the buttons. And how do we handle the pressing of the buttons? Well, all we need to do is to define a handler. And so we're going to call this method handle click, for lack of a better name. And this method has to take a specific object as input, and it's an object of type view. And the reason for this is that when you associate a handler to a widget, the widget generates an event, the method is called, and the widget that generated the event is passed and through a view object, as a view object. So basically what we're doing here is we're defining a handle click that will be called by both buttons when they're clicked, and we're going to distinguish between the two buttons using this view object. The view object looks like we need to import because it wasn't imported already, so we're just going to do this. And by the way, the ID allows you to do that when the solution is obvious with a click of a button, which is nice. And so at this point we have this method, and what we want to do is associate this method to the button. So we're going to go back to our interface, and if everything works correctly, when I select the button, I should have a chance of associating here. As you can see, there's this on click. And I can, so what the IDE does is checking your code. There's only one method that takes the right argument, so that's the only one that's proposed. So I just select handle click, and what this means is that every time this guy is clicked, handle click is invoked. And I do the same thing for reset. I select handle click as the handler. So at this point, I created a connection, so I can go back to my activity. And what I need to do is, as I was saying, distinguish between the two cases. So I'm just going to use a switch for that. Well, the switch might be overkill in this case, but because I only have two possible options. But that's fine in case you want to extend this and associate more widgets to this handler. You can do it by just extending adding more cases. So what we're going to do, we're going to take the view object, get the ID of the object using the method getID. And at this point, since we know the IDs of our widgets, what we can do, we can easily implement what to do in the two cases. So the first case will be the case of the ID being r.id.button convert. Okay, so what we're doing here is we are handling the conversion. So I'm going to define a string that contains my result, and let's see, I call it result, just result. And for simplicity, I'm also going to define a string value that's going to contain my value. The value is the one stored in the value in the text value widget. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna use the text value widget, and I'm gonna get the text from the value widget. And then since the text is not in string format, I'm gonna invoke toString on it to convert it to a string. So what this statement does is simply to take the text from the text value and convert it to a string. So, and this is my initial value. So at this point, I need to distinguish the case when I'm converting from miles to kilometers or the other one. And so to do that, I'm just gonna use the information that is provided by the radio button. So what I do is just checking if my radio button from miles is checked, I'm going to convert from miles to kilometers, which means that my result is is going to be equal to miles to kilometers, and I'm going to pass the value as a parameter. Otherwise, I'm going the other way around, and therefore I'll just select my result to be kilometers to miles, and again I'm going to pass the value as the parameter. So at the end of this operation, result should contain the right value and the right result, and so all I need to do is to set this result in the field that contains the result, and that's the text result widget. And so what I need to do is to invoke set text and just pass the result, and that's pretty much it. So this is the core of the application. Again, if it's the button convert is clicked, I get the value, I checked whether I'm converting from miles to kilometers or the other way around, and then I do the computation and I set the value of the result field. We had two buttons, so we also want to handle the second case, and the second case is the one of the reset button. So this is called button reset, and in this case, if button reset is pressed, all we want to do is basically to reinitialize the GUI. So the way in which we're going to do this is we're going to select the radio buttons from kilometers and set it to checked, because that was the initial state of the interface. We're gonna set to unchecked the one from miles, and then we wanna set to an empty string both the value and the result. So to do this, we use set text and we just set it to an empty string. So similarly, text result, we're gonna do set text and set it to an empty string. So at this point, unless I forgot something, we should be able to run the application and see it in action. So let's just deploy it again on the Pixel 2. Let's see, it should be compiling and transferring, and here we go, we have the application, and now let's just give it a shot. So let's see if we want to convert 100 kilometers into miles, we get 62 miles, and that sounds pretty much correct. We can also go the other way around. Let's say we're going to transform 100 miles into kilometers. Going to do a convert, and we get 160.9, which sounds about right. And we can also reset the application, and everything works fine, exactly as expected. So the last thing I want to do, I just want to have something fancy which might be useful to the application. We're going to add a toast, and so we're going to again remove this, and so we're going to put some basically error checking, as a minimal error checking on the application. And the way in which we're going to do this is by making sure that there is an actual value to convert. And so let me just do a quick check by checking if the value length is 0, which means that basically there's no that the string that you're trying to convert, that the value you're trying to convert is empty. Just take this at face value, because it's the standard way of creating toasts. So we're gonna do it, get the context for our application, and we do this by calling get application context. We need the right import, so again we're gonna use just the ID to fix that. And the next thing we need to do, we want to create some text. So we're going to use a char sequence. We're going to call it text, and we're going to say error empty value. So here we're just saying, hey, you shouldn't be trying to convert an empty value. And at this point, we also want to define the duration for the toast. And let's say that we want to toast provides some the toast is basically a pop-up. The toast provides a various length. So let's say we're going to say length long. So we're going to have it stay there on screen for some time. And the last thing we're going to do is create a toast, which we call, without too much fantasy, toast. and we're gonna say toast, make text, and we're gonna provide the context that we computed, the text that we defined, and the duration. And at this point, we just need to show the toast. So just do toast.show. And what will happen is that when something like this happens, so when the value is empty, this toast is shown. And of course, we want to also make it so that the rest happens only if there is actually something to convert. So we're gonna put everything into an else. I could have done it better, but there you go. So at this point, unless I made mistakes, I should be able to run this, and if I try to convert an empty value, I should get a toast. So let's deploy it again on our Pixel 2. The application is copied, it's run, and now let's do the test. Let's try to convert an empty value, and as you can see, this is appearing and then disappearing. Is telling me that there is an error. So toasts are kind of an elegant way of handling this sort of transient error conditions. This is all I wanted to show you. Hopefully the demo was useful in case you never developed an Android application before, and you can use it as a starting point to build your own. So with this, I'm gonna close the emulator, and I hope you enjoy developing your first app.